Most unlikely of villains, just folds of the brain and four paws. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bark or does it meow? In the lair of the cerebral, head will show and so much more. It will leave your brains at the door.
Well, welcome everyone to a long overdue episode of Cerebrivore. This is BJ Boyd. I'm the host of normally the Arcane Alienist podcast. We have some of our regular Cerebrivore contributors here and a special first-time contributor. So why don't we go around and you guys introduce yourselves? You mean to just call on you as I see you on the screen, or you want to jump? Okay, well, we'll start with our special guest, the one of the newest members of the Anchor community, relatively speaking. That is Mirke the Meek. How you doing today?
Okay. Anything else you want me to say?
Well, a little bit. You've got two podcasts right now that you're doing, correct?
Yeah, two major ones. Mirke the Meek. I cover card games, board games, RPGs, nerdy type stuff there. I'm also doing Euphonious and Dungeon, which is people call in with their responses to watching Delicious in Dungeon and how it could apply to RPGs.
Yeah.
So that's 3 episodes in, enjoying that. I also have Magic Tech Mirke, which is just a little bit of posting every now and again about my tech journey and podcasting in that as well.
Great. So everybody be sure to check out all those offerings. So next we have Karl Rodriguez.
Hello, I'm Karl. I'm the host, but not producer of the GMologist Presents. And we have a podcast and a YouTube channel where we do actual play that I've heard is like really raw and actual play, not voice actors, which I think is a good comment. So, and BJ has run games there. I have guest GMs, and I run some regular games on there.
Great. Good to see you, Karl. We have Arlen Walker.
Yeah, hi, I'm Arlen, and I do basically anything that's named Pellam's Wasteland, and if it's still going, then that's even better. No, I have used to do a podcast, and I have a YouTube channel that is all still up, but I haven't updated in a long time. So hit me up on Discord if you care about my stuff, because otherwise I probably won't see it.
All right. And last but not least, the ubiquitous member of the Anchor community, Jason Connerly.
Yeah, I'm Jason, the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, which just finished up season 1, just shy of 650 episodes. There's a Nerds RPG Variety Cast blog out there. All that's pretty easy to find. You can find me on Discord or calling into your favorite podcast.
All right, great. So, well, the topic we want to discuss for this episode is, I guess a good title for this would be the carrot and the stick.
Mm-hmm.
And it is how you provide incentives, or I guess disincentives, since we're talking about carrots and sticks, for specific types of player behavior. What are the pros and cons? Is that a good strategy, a bad strategy? And what are the implications of the different approaches that have been suggested over the years, or maybe some ideas we've come up with ourselves or have experienced ourselves? So that's what we want to talk about. And I think it's kind of made the circles in a lot of our podcasts, and a lot of the people that we kind of call into and hang out with, and the Anchor. I'm still calling it the Anchor community. I guess we'll call it that until until we're all dead and gone, I guess. But that's
we get a cease and desist letter from Spotify.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if we just started our own Anchor.
Oh, I know.
Brand, if they would have issue with that, or anyway, that's getting off topic though. So that's what we want to talk about today, is a little bit about rewarding player behavior and how you go about doing that, and what works and doesn't work, things along that nature. So I guess the first And what I would like to do, and maybe as part of the discussion, since away from podcasting and gaming, my training is as a psychologist, is maybe talk a little bit about some of the psychological principles, not so much on whether you should or shouldn't do something, but just to understand what principles might be at work so you can make an informed decision on whether you want to try a particular approach or not. And the one I kind of, as we were chatting before we pressed record, that maybe we could start with is suggesting that you got to know your players and what motivates them, their personalities, their comfort zones, and things like that. And I know we've had a little bit of a discussion on Discord based on one of Spencer's Keep Off the Borderland. It had talked about the fourth dimension of role playing. There's a couple of YouTube videos out there that I think a lot of us were sort of maybe a little critical of, this idea that fully immersive role playing is the only way to really role play. But I think that takes a person with a certain motivation, a certain personality, a certain desire for what they want out of the game. And it was a little, I guess the video that kind of stuck in everybody's craw was a guy kind of suggesting that the rest of us who don't do that are really just playing glorified board games. And he was a little kind of condescending in his tone. So I think one thing is important about understanding the personalities of the players you have and why they play the game and what they want to get out of the game. And it's not that everybody at the same table has to have those identical motivations, but it is helpful to know. And I guess the thing that, and I'll turn it over to you guys after I guess I should get to the point, is one of the first things I always think about is one of the most robust kind of common things that most people can figure out about themselves and about your friends. Are they introverted or are they extroverted? Introverts tend to they'd be more quiet. They take a little longer to speak up, but introverts also tend to sometimes be very thoughtful and detail oriented in their approach to stuff. And so sometimes it's good to have an introverted player in the group who's taking notes, paying attention to everything the game master has said and put out there. Can really help with strategy and problem solving. And so when I see a lot of advice tends to be to offer players some sort of incentive, and we'll talk about the types of incentives in a minute, to speak up, to speak in character, to role play in a very engaged way with an NPC or the way they describe their interaction environments. You may be asking someone to really step out of the comfort zone and do something that's just not in their nature, very difficult for them, not something they signed up to do, and something that can be very draining. I know, like, true introverts, it's not that they don't want to have friends or they don't like to do things socially, but an hour and a half of socialization will just drain them. And if you're trying to have a 3-4 hour game session, you don't want to exhaust those people before you even hit the halfway point by forcing them. Or the flip side of that is they lose out on a reward or a benefit everybody else gets because, I think I said before we record, no one has ever suggested offering XP to an extrovert to shut up. But it's the same thing as for putting that out there. So I'll let you guys kind of talk about that. I want to go around. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the other thing maybe we can all touch on or get thoughts on is a lot of times you'll see advice on how to get a player involved and how to drag them into the game. And different people enjoy the game different ways. Some people can, like you say, they're detail oriented, they're following along, but they really don't want to speak up. They don't want to be the face person for the group. They're happy to sit there and listen to everybody else role play along, roll the dice when their turn. They're paying attention. It's not that they're not paying attention. They're not ready to play. They are, but they just don't want to engage as much. And I think you could actually do some harm by trying to make them get engaged. And you see all this advice. And if your whole group's like that, then yeah, you need, if nobody's throwing ideas out, everybody's silent, obviously you have to do something. But if, 3 of the 4 members of the group are active and engaged and the 4th member is quiet, but they're having a great time, there really isn't any reason to force them to be more vocal. But you often see advice saying, hey, this is how you make them engage. And
right.
Maybe you're hurting yourself in the long run by trying to force them to engage.
Well, I think it often depends a lot on the nature of the group and the circumstance. Like I am someone who I would say is pretty introverted. And often with like people I don't know, I'm a lot more uncomfortable with speaking up or being the person who, introduces their character first, all of that sort of stuff. So like at a convention game, I find it the little bit of boost of like, hey, everybody, the sort of socially acceptable introduction period is kind of helpful as like the social lubricant to like everybody start talking, and then we're sort of into the flow of the game. With a group, if you're playing with your friends and you all know each other pretty well, I think that becomes often a lot less necessary. And if somebody is still not talking as much, that it depends on what people are comfortable with, and that sometimes I think most all of us need a little bit of a boost to come out of the shell, and sometimes what we need is people to not bother us while we're in our shell because we're having a fine time in there and don't need anything else. And it's really just a matter of reading the room, figuring out who's having fun doing what, and ultimately just ask your players, hey, did you have fun in the session? And if somebody who was really quiet had plenty of fun, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Karl, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I think it's also game dependent, right? I mean, so people have different talents. They engage in the game in a different way. And I would say like sometimes, not all the time, I mean, but sometimes an introvert is the one who, say in a game like Traveler, does the ship design, does the space trucking, but they're not going to be the face necessarily of the group. They let someone else do it. But I also notice that the same person is always the one who's like, hey, are we going to play today? Or always thanks me for the game. Right. So, so even if you don't think they're engaged, then you get, I guess, you get evidence that they are engaged because they do contribute to the game. And I think that's a great, observation. I mean, as a GM, when you're reading the room, as Arlen said, dealing with your players in a con game too, right? I mean, I guess you're on the spot as a GM to do that, but I mean, you really got to read the room and see who's going to be the face. And then I guess that's why, really it's kind of like almost in a way disingenuous for a GM to reward, almost outgoing. I don't know. It's hard to say that because it's almost spontaneous that you want to reward outgoing behavior, but is that fair to everyone else? And I guess that's what I look at ultimately is like, is it fair, and how are people engaging in the game? And definitely they're always having fun because that's why they keep coming back, or that's why they're there. That's why they signed up for your game, right? In the con. So they're there to have fun, and they have fun in their own different way.
Well, and yeah, sorry, I'm going to say this and shut up because real quick, I apologize, Mirke. The other thing is when you're rewarding that outgoing player, their reward is the interaction from the other players at the table. They don't need an in-game reward. If they say a joke and everybody laughs, that's the reward. You don't need to also give them a Benny because they made everybody laugh. But I apologize, Mirke. Go ahead.
Good, Mirke.
I'll just have an anecdote right here, I guess. So during the pandemic, my mom came to live with us, and Pathfinder 2 was coming out. So we all got the rule books, and we coaxed my mom into playing. She's never played a role-playing game ever. She's in her 70s. She was reluctant, but she wanted to spend time with her kids, so she went with it. And she would sit there and knit while I was GMing. And her ranger character, every once in a while, she would say, well, I want to intimidate this guy, or I want to convince this guy. And I wanted a little bit more than that. I didn't want her to like have to dive deep into role play or anything, but I was like, well, what kind of things would you say to this person to convince them or intimidate them? And she would get a little squeamish and like, I don't really want to do this, but she would actually kind of come up with a few bullet points, and that's all I needed. And then from there, like I could figure out how this NPC was going to react to that. And then if we needed to roll, we would roll and go from there. Yeah. So no reward was really needed to get her to do that, but she's my mom. She's humoring me. It might be different with other circumstances, but it's like, what level do you need to go to? What are you comfortable with, and what are they comfortable with? I was just fine with, hey, give me some bullet points. I'm not looking for amazing role play here, and we'll just move on from there.
I'm kind of curious. You talk a lot about playing with your two girls who are still fairly young. Do you notice with them, do they have different approaches or different things that really kind of excite them about role-playing games? Do you see differences in their personalities or their approach?
I just took a picture last night of our gaming table. We were doing some Mouse Ritter, and my 11-year-old totally engaged. She's got our character sheets and everything. The 9-year-old on the other end of the table has a huge bin of Legos, and she's building Legos as she's listening because she just glazes over if the action isn't, if it's not moving rapidly. But she's still paying attention. She knows what's going on. It's just she's more engaged if she's also got something else to do on the side.
Yeah. Never get upset with your players if they're doodling on their notepad or drawing a picture of the monster they're fighting or their character or something, as long as they're still paying attention. I know I'm with a bunch of teenagers right now, and the interesting thing is the way they all know each other is through theater. So it's a bunch of theater kids. So you would think, oh, well, they'll have no problem with, but even among these kids who that's kind of their common experience together. You can see some of them are very introverted and some are extroverted, and some of them I have to routinely kind of stop and go, hey, do you have any thoughts? What's your character doing? Or do you want to say anything here? And if they do, great. If not, no. But even there, you can see that you would think that they'd all be just sort of talking over each other. There's a few of them who are, and I say, hey, wait, slow down. But then there are some who are very much more methodical and quiet and just taking it all in before they make a decision. So,
well, and I think it seems to me that the kind of default assumptions behind the logic of kind of carrot and stick get people to talk is that a player that is speaking up is engaged in the game, and that what we're getting at really is that a player who is speaking up may well be engaged in the game, but a player who is not speaking up is not necessarily not engaged. That they have also, plenty of people have different ways that they engage with, not just RPGs, but especially with RPGs in a kind of group social environment. I think we all have the experience of, especially in a large group, the 4 or 5 players that are sitting close to the GM who want to be engaged in everything, and the couple of players who are sitting at the other end of the table who are having fun talking to each other and eating snacks and being with their friends and aren't really as concerned with the game itself. And that's right, as long as everybody at the table is fine with that, that's just fine. I think it feels fairly uncomfortable for me to imagine a GM in a game that I'm a part of thinking, okay, well, the players aren't talking enough, so they need to talk more. And the way I will do it is by offering people who talk XP instead of just saying, hey, are we all actually engaged with the game, and having a more direct conversation about it.
Yeah. So, well, I thought, let's go back to the origins of the game as you guys are talking. I'm thinking about, and I stand to be corrected if somebody knows better, but my impression is in the early days of D&D, particularly with Gary Gygax and Arneson and the people they played with, their characters were in a lot of ways kind of just have an avatar for themselves moving around in the game world, and they might ascribe certain traits to that character in terms of a motivation or an alignment, but they didn't go deep into first person role playing with that. It was just, when it came to a decision point, they were kind of expected to make a decision based on their class, their alignment, their race or species, but they didn't have to act it out in the first person. It was just more, is that the act of an evil person or a good person? Is that, and I think that gets into the somewhat now controversial AD&D rating system that Gygax has in the Dungeon Master's Guide of, at the end of every adventure, assigning every player a ranking based on how well they portrayed their class and their alignment. But you notice in there, he's not suggesting verbosity or any other sort of engagement. The stuff we're talking about is simply that the choices they make and the actions they took reflect the character class they're playing and also the alignment they've stated, in terms of moral and ethical choices. And that's the rankings. And whether you like that ranking system or not, it is, and it does. It's not a bonus XP or a Benny kind of thing, but it affects how long they have to take away from adventuring to train. You know, the better they did, the faster they train to level up once they get the amount of XP they need to level up. So it saves us some time and I think some gold potentially in that regard. So there's a benefit there. So, yeah, Jason.
I was just going to say that there first person role playing did exist. I don't think there was ever this full immersion, the 4D concept. And also to clarify, the 4D thing, there's nothing wrong playing that way. The big reason everybody gets up in arms, especially at that 1% or 28 millimeter somebody or another on YouTube, is because he just came across that everybody else was doing it wrong. And which, as you said, it's not so much that we think you're wrong to do first person all the time role play. It's that,
I think you're
don't lord it over. Oh, Arlen,
not allowed to play it that way.
Yeah, you're not allowed to. But I think that some of that in-character play did exist back in the day. I mean, we look prior to D&D existing, across the pond over in England with the Old West gunfight. They talked as their cowboys and acted as. And when you look at Braunstein and then Blackmore, which evolved out of Braunstein, it might not be as theatrical as Critical Role or something, which we could argue whether that's even role playing or not, right? But I think those kind of things did exist back then. But you're not wrong with D&D, and especially with Gygaxes, from what I've read, that kind of group and that core group and that style still exists today. The idea of playing it, your character is your class and your alignment and all that. We see that like with the classic adventure game folks and things like that.
Karl, you were.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, what I really enjoy when I'm running a game is like if someone spontaneously breaks into first person, that's great, but it's never a requirement. And most of the time you see people jump back and forth. Well, my character would do X, and then, or, they start talking in character. And I think it's really great. I think one anecdote I thought was really the best example, I think, of like a first person role playing. And it was odd because it was like a bunch of people coming from like a tabletop game. We were playing a game called Death Watch where you play Space Marines in a 40K. And this was everyone got into like first person role playing. And I was like, whoa, this is really happening. Because they're like, Battle Brother, I'm going to, they started talking like as if they're Space Marines. But I mean, it's never a requirement. And like I said, usually both people go back and forth between them. But it's kind of cool, But I don't think you should like, oh, if you all speak like character X did in their Polish accent, then you're all going to get extra rewards. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, that's I think is where, just let the players play right as they want to play. I think that's what I like to see.
Yeah, I know, Mark, when you brought it up on your podcast, as sort of as a kind of newer to D&D, it was like, what is this? Gary Gygax is, and I've always kind of joked that even to the benefit of that system, if it's there, it's needlessly complex. I think the first time I read through it, I had to read it 5 or 6 times, and I was like, okay, I see what this is. But you've got between Gary's like high Gygaxian, language, and then the number of sort of determinations and calculations. It's like there's probably a simpler way to do this, but it makes sense in context. So I just wanted to bring that up just because I think it's a precursor to what we're talking about.
Thought I'd add, it's kind of an interesting thing because there is, I think, sort of a diegetic justification conceptually that a character that better fulfills the sort of expectations of their class would be able to become better at doing the things that class does more quickly, right? That they sort of more closely align to the archetype that is what they are becoming, which I think is lost in the discussion of, well, we need you to speak up more as your character, because that's part of the game. That at least with the idea of like, well, if you play a fighter who doesn't do fighter things very often, and so it takes you longer to train, that sort of conceptually makes sense within the game world, that like a fighter that doesn't do fighter things wouldn't get good at doing more fighter things nearly as quickly. In the same way, a wizard that's spending their time doing something other than wizard stuff is going to take longer to get good at doing the wizard stuff. And that's kind of an interesting distinction there.
Yeah.
Even though I also think that Gary Gygax's version of that is insanely overcomplicated and pretty much unnecessary.
Karl's got his hand up. I wanted to just add.
Yeah, I had it and then I lost it and then I got it back again, which is amazing. So no, I thought that was it's very interesting, right? Where you're talking about Gygax and how incentivizing a style of player, how to play your character. But I've noticed some modern games, i.e. free league games, one of the things they do on how to generate XP is you need did you follow your moral code? Did you pursue your big dream? Did you interact in a meaningful way with your buddy, right? So they incentivize sort of role-playing aspects that can lead to XP in those games. I just thought that was an interesting,
it kind of tries
contrast
to do it
or
in
comparison, really, to
and trying to do it
older
in
style of games.
in an objective way where it's just a yes or no. Yes, I see an example where you did this. Yeah, Arlen.
Well, and I will also add the Blades in the Dark games do something very similar where they have kind of like Powered by the Apocalypse. All the characters have different playbooks, but what the playbooks are basically just how your character gains XP and how your character can access upgrades. That for the most part, the sort of core mechanical elements of every character are pretty much the same in terms of here's your skills and here's your attributes and here's how you calculate everything. That the thing that distinguishes the playbooks is really the unique elements of advancement, basically. That, a character who plays a brawler, they get XP when they get into brawls, but the character who plays like I think about specifically the sort of Star Warsy version of Blades in the Dark, and they have all the classic Star Wars archetypes. So if you're basically like a monastic space wizard, you get XP for doing monastic space wizard stuff, and if you're a daring pilot, you get XP for doing daring pilot stuff. But that's basically the core of when you pick out your character. What you're basically picking out is how do you actually advance and what's the sort of archetype that you flow into that way.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to some more specifics. Maybe you guys have any other thoughts in general on those things before we go on to the next thing.
I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail here, but the AD&D rating stuff, part of that discussion was about rules as written, and we don't have to go that way, but the whole concept of imposing you need to play a fighter this way, it is very much that carrot and stick reward system, and I struggle with that, probably coming from more modern games where I want to play a fighter, but I want to play it my way, not Gary's way, and I don't like the idea of now I have to train harder because of I didn't play it Gary's way. But also I do understand where Ireland's coming from as well.
Jason?
Yeah, and just to, we see that in other places in those games, right? Like if you have a high prime requisite, you get a bonus to XP is the exact same kind of thing. Like if you roll high strength, you should be playing a fighter, or I'm going to penalize. Well, if you want to play a fighter with low strength, I'm going to penalize you for. And actually, you need more XP if you have a really low strength to level up. So it's the same kind of thing. So it's kind
most of what the stats do is that they get a little bit of a benefit other places, but the big thing that the stats do is basically tell you which character class you should play if you have any special ones.
Right. If you're playing a wizard with an 8 intelligence, it's going to take you forever to level up because you get a penalty XP penalty every time you earn XP.
Some of those characters could, the wizard that shouldn't be a wizard, that is a trope in fantasy, and it could be fun to play.
Dragon Slayer, the movie.
Yeah, exactly. So you get penalized for trying to do something unique. I don't know. I would still love to try AD&D, and I wouldn't mind the rating system, but we don't have to keep going down this way.
But I think you got to think about what is the kind of game we're playing. If we're playing a game where all tropes are open because they can be entertaining and compelling and create interesting situations, including, a thief who's got butterfingers and a stupid wizard or a fighter with a glass jaw that goes down after one strong hit. if you're playing a kind of game where, particularly it's more of a narrative storytelling game, that works a lot. If you're playing kind of classic D&D, I don't know if they were coming to the table initially to play those kinds of games. It was really to lean into the archetype and have successful adventures. So, yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, just last thing, and I think Arlen has something. We can move on, but you're not wrong, Mirke, by any means. But that game is designed to give that experience, right? So, and you don't have to play D&D that way. You can house rule it. You don't have to use the rating system. You don't have to use those things. But there are games that are designed to give that experience, like Burning Wheel, or in some of these other games that. Not telling everybody to go out and buy Burning Wheel, but there are games designed to cater to other kinds of experiences, which is one of the great things about RPGs is no matter what experience you want, right now, there's probably a game out there that that caters to it, right? So it's pretty great. But
Well,
you're not wrong. It is very prescriptive how they want you to play it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that also goes to, I think it's sort of a quirk of history that D&D has become the standard of fantasy RPG gaming, and that in its earliest iterations, I mean, we've talked a lot about you could do all sorts of fantasy things within the framework of old school D&D, but it seems pretty clear that Gygax didn't imagine that people would be doing it that way, and that along those lines that I think part of a lot of those elements in early D&D to me come out of the wargaming background and the idea of the party as being really, really very much like wargaming, that kind of success oriented. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to make the plan. We're going to get into the dungeon. We're going to get the gold. We're going to get out. Much like sitting down to play a skirmish game with a specific objectives, all that sort of stuff. And that a lot of the structure that D&D has moved away from, I think, comes as much as anything from having players who do not want to play a skirmish war game, but instead want to do something fairly different, or in some cases maybe do want to play a skirmish war game because they're playing 4E.
I will say one last comment. We can get off D&D and BJ steer us back towards carrot and stick or whatever. But it's funny because in the earliest editions of D&D, if you wanted to play that low intelligence wizard in OD&D, other than the experience point negative, really there's nothing hurting you in that. If you want to play a Fumble Fingers Thief, you can do that in OD&D. Where the newer versions of D&D, you're looked at as you're screwing your party. If in third edition on, if you're playing an inept character, you're a bad person for doing that. Where in OD&D, you're not. So I think it's kind of interesting that as the game has evolved, these niches and having to be good at your niche so you don't let your party down is become reinforced in the game.
Yeah.
Well, just
Karl, when you're talking about the skirmish war game, I think particularly when you pull out the original motivation was to work into domain play. The fastest way to get into domain play is if you're a fighter, to be a successful warrior who leads mercenaries into battle. If the wizard wants to acquire enough power to build a tower, the cleric wants to acquire enough prestige to found their own cloister or become the head of their order and build a temple. And when those sort of get pulled out of the game, what's left is, well, how am I supposed to lean into the class that I'm doing? Well, it becomes more about telling the story of those characters as opposed to a specific type of accomplishment, which builds towards more of a skirmish game or a war game. Mirke, you have one other.
Well, I guess in the rules of AD&D, we can see how Gary was trying to use in-game rewards. He didn't like the direction OD&D was going. He wanted it to go his way. This is how he was going to reward his players. And I mean, obviously, AD&D was extremely popular, so the game style did fit for a lot of people. But it is interesting to, this is how he wanted to reward his players with the rating system, et cetera, et cetera. And that was his carrot or stick.
Which is really interesting in two aspects. One, that AD&D to this day is still one of the most play-tested games before it hit the market out there. Believe it or not, it really was. And the other thing is Gygax didn't play by a heck of a lot of the rules in that rule book in his personal game. So
the irony.
Yeah, he didn't use a ton of those rules in himself. Now, if he ran a tournament at Gen Con, maybe he used all the rules. I don't know, but in his personal game, he didn't use a ton of those rules anyway, which is kind of interesting. But
my understanding is
yeah.
you pick any random game designer who's published a game and you go sit at their table and they're not using the rules of their own game. You know, they've been hired to write a game and this is what we put to the public. But at my table, I use half these rules and I have 3 or 4 house rules I use instead. And
yeah, I've seen like actual play with the game designer running, and I'm like, that's not how okay, you're running your own rules on your own table. That's cool. You know, it happens.
so anyway, so let's get on to the next topic. And I guess one of the things I want to talk about is what are those behaviors that we want to see out of players, assuming that we don't have to see everything, you know, we want to be a little flexible, but what are some of the ones you guys think come up time and time again where it's like, I really would like my players to do more of that or less of that? Go ahead, Jason.
I'll take the easy one. Take notes. You want your player to be the scribe and do the session write-up. And most of us, even those of us that are 100% against the idea of rewarding at-a-game activity with in-game rewards, are willing to break that to give somebody a handful of experience points to do that session write-up after the session, so we don't have to, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I know in my home group, because I'm going to use that as my anecdote wheelhouse or well that I'm going to jump into. So there is actually just one player who always the scribe, but I've never thought about giving them a reward because they want to be the scribe and like, oh, and someone player across the table go, oh, are you blah blah blah? Are you taking notes? Right. So it's like it's almost expected now. But I did throw out, you know, now I go, hey, I'll give the whole group X amount of XP reward if someone does a narrative for our session, and I can read it out on my podcast, or, you know, for example, you know, to give like a narrative of actual play. So far, no takers, but you know, I've thrown that out there. But I know it's crazy, right? That you're right. Someone has a scribe, someone's a mapper, right? We really haven't given. I haven't thought about giving XP for those like out of, you know, sort of out of game, but part of the game activities.
Yeah,
I have not been in a game where we don't have somebody taking notes, and nobody's asked people to do it. It's just like part and parcel. Yeah, I just pulled out my notebook. I'm a note taker, and there was another there's a character that we had, well, a player that we had in the 5e game that I was a long time player in. She would take copious notes. She wasn't the most talkative, but plenty of notes. And when we were like, well, what were we doing there? Or like, what was that again? She was right there with the information. So it was very thorough. And yeah, just like every single campaign I've been in, there's somebody taking notes and no need for a reward. But is that the same for y'all?
I found that in a lot of my groups. It always, sometimes it's me and sometimes it's not me. It depends on everybody that's there. But yeah, there's always somebody who keeps track of the treasure or who takes the best notes, so everybody knows just to rely on them. And it seems to be a natural thing. I know in old D&D there was the sort of the idea that you needed to formally have someone appointed as the mapper, someone formally appointed as the caller or the spokesman of the group. And I've read, you know, the Pink Phantom has done a complete read through of Muster over the last several months. I read that book as well, and there's a part where he talks about the wargaming way is for the group to develop a doctrine, a set of procedures by which they tackle specific challenges, so the DM doesn't have to ask every time and they don't have to describe every time. As far as how do they check for traps at doors, how do they explore a room or a hallway, but the other part of that was everybody taking on a role that may not be their character's role, but as part of their role as a group of collaborative players, and somebody be the quartermaster, somebody be the key, you know. But I think if I'm remembering right, the implication there is find something for everybody to do. It's not about rewarding them, that person, but just everybody needs to find some way that they're going to help kind of support the group in staying organized and on task. And so there really wouldn't be any need for individual rewards because that's just part of it. Everybody divide up the work. And particularly so you take some of that off the dungeon master. Go ahead. Yeah.
So instead of a carrot, I feel like that's more of a stick thing. If you don't take notes, you won't know what's going on, and you will forget situations that could benefit your characters. And tough luck. You didn't remember it. You should have been taking notes. Sorry, you have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah. Well, I
Seems
don't know
like
about you guys, but I find myself sometimes in situations where I'm like, hey, that's an honest mistake, and your character would remember that even though you didn't. And it's part of the game master's job to really kind of be your actual sensorum in the world.
Yeah.
To point out the things you would notice and things like that. At the same time, I've been in that place as a frustrated game master where it's like, guys, I cannot do all this.
Well, I think the version of that I've encountered more, it seems like, is with treasure. That the idea of like, if nobody wrote down the treasure, if it was rolled randomly, we're not going to go back and try to like, figure out what the treasure was. It's, oh, I guess those chests disappeared or something, basically if it's in the nebulous party loot stage and hasn't been distributed and nobody bothers to even write it down, you don't actually get to bring that back to civilization, which, as easy as it is to write down treasure, seems pretty fair to me generally, although it can be annoying. It seems like sometimes when you're like, hey, wait a second, didn't we find, 2 potions in that last encounter? And it's like, well, nobody wrote it down, so.
Yeah, and I think that's something you establish kind of almost in session 0, or if you have a long-term group of players, hey, I'm not going to keep track of this stuff, as the GM says. If you want to keep it, here's how it goes. Someone needs to keep track of it, right? And I guess a group who's understanding of that will follow along, and you'll have like the quartermaster and the loot distribution phase, and someone who takes notes about all the different things, and I mean, and then I think for me, just if someone didn't take the notes and they're like, well, I don't remember if this happened or that happened, I go, well, hey, there's mechanics where you can have them roll to see if they remember, and if not, well, like Mirke said, oh well, your character doesn't remember. I mean, it's a little harsh, but as you establish that home group and establish this is how it's going to go, then hopefully they will learn, right? I mean,
somewhere out there now, there's a creative. I'll have to put pen to paper on this. Is to create some sort of monster that its sole purpose for existing in a RPG setting is it clouds the memory of the player characters and takes off with parts of their treasure. It's like, if you don't, but kind of tongue in cheek describe it as, this is what happens to the stuff you don't write down. It gets consumed by this creature, but the thought eater. Good idea.
Weird duck skeleton thing.
Yeah. So in a game where gold translates into XP, that becomes, I think, people learn not to push that aside and not pay attention. But when you get into kind of more modern games where the XP is not about the amount of treasure, those are there's less of an inherent incentive to keep close tabs on that, because, and I think particularly if you've played a lot of sort of modern D&D Pathfinder where you continue to amass gold the way you did in original D&D, but there's really nothing to do with it because you're not saving up to build a castle or raise an army. You wind up, it's like I'm sort of this itinerant adventurer, and I've got I have the wealth of a prince, by 10th or 12th level, and then
we do this discussion again?
No.
No, I will say.
So note taking.
So note taking, I think another sort of unspoken role sometimes that can be really good is basically the person who is willing to engage with the things that the DM puts out there, especially in conversational scenes. Seems like when there is certainly me as somebody who gets uncomfortable in conversations that might be about something difficult or where I feel like the person is annoyed at me or things like that, that it can be really valuable to have the player who's like, yeah, I understand we're all sort of playing along and get into, having the argument with the knights that are about to attack and things like that. And basically I think I think speaks to what we all as GMs would like for players to, be willing to engage with the interesting things that create the interesting story, without necessarily always being able to put that into words to say, hey guys, don't you want the exciting story event that is also going to be kind of uncomfortable to happen? And having the player who is willing to dive feet first into the adventure is always a happy discovery at the table.
So the person who's going to just make, all right, it's been 10 minutes, nothing's happened. I'm going to pick a fight.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Something has to happen in the story, and if it doesn't happen because of something external, we're going to figure out how to make it happen. Is like, it can be uncomfortable at times, I think, when they do something that you don't expect, but it always, I think, is ultimately generally a positive for the group experience as a whole. And it's, without being a mapper role or a note taker role or anything like that, it is sort of a group dynamic role that I think is helpful.
Yeah. Jason.
So I got us a little bit off track there, and we've kind of skirted this. Can anybody think of something that is, as far as the carrot end of it goes, worth or a good thing to reward them in game and add a game thing? We've kind of talked about the jokester who gets the feedback from the other players laughing, so they don't necessarily need it. My experience seems atypical as far as needing to bribe somebody to do session reports and things. So what behavior, what would justify the carrot?
I think it's situational, and I think maybe I look at it as kind of more like ongoing game with your regular group of players versus a con game. I think at a con game, if someone makes a great joke that causes everyone to is at the table, since it's a one shot, you're not going to play this again. I think it's a great opportunity to encourage that joke or that, fun experience for everyone at the table, and give that person a Benny or whatever, right? It's in a game that has meta currency or something like that. I think or give them like a boon of some sort, or lean into it in the game if there's no meta currency in the game, and, sort of lean into it and make it sort of a narrative reward for the whole group, right? So I think something like that is really great. It's a one shot. It's not gonna become a behavioral thing down the line in like a home group. Now, in my home group, I wouldn't do that necessarily, because then what I've seen, because I've probably done this in the past before, is like someone makes a joke, I give them a reward, then everyone starts to make jokes. It goes totally, off the rails, the game, and it becomes distracting. So I think in a home group or an ongoing game, it doesn't work. But in a one shot, I think it might be a cool idea to do, just to get everyone engaged and having fun at the table.
So my question there is, now obviously Savage Worlds games with bennies and meta currency are a little bit different animal here, but you could also reward them with a piece of candy or bring a bowl of goodies or something like that too, right?
Yeah. It's a good idea. Yeah.
But I think that one thing that Arlen had mentioned kind of in our chats leading up to this episode, we want to talk a little bit about over justification, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And I think one of the things we were just talking about is you may have a group that just does all this on its own if you just let them. Why create an external reward for something that they've internally figured out how to do and everybody's happy and it works, and there's, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Would be one thing, because once you start putting an external reward on behavior, then you have to think about, am I rewarding it consistently? Am I rewarding it fairly?
Well,
And some people could even lose their motivation because when before they just kind of did it naturally, it was just, I'm just kind of doing this now. It's work because I'm having to think about doing it correctly to get the
reward.
the payoff. Yeah.
well, or especially if I think the concept of like the sort of idea of everybody at the table, the players get like a Benny for their jokes, but the game master keeps wanting to make it more and more, difficult to ramp up the tension. And so at some point it turns into the players have brought, this much material so that they'll get enough bennies so that they can hang with the bad guys that are getting worse and worse. And the idea of like, that sounds terrible, although it would be really funny probably in the moment, but conceptually the idea of like, that kind of arms race carrot and stick policy in a game sounds a lot less fun than just everybody being like, let's not do any of that and just play the game by itself and let the external stuff be the external stuff. I think for me, the consistent one that I have offered is for session write-ups or note-taking type stuff that I think it was like a Hyperborea game where I think what it was is you get an extra 5 or 10% XP on top of your whatever bonus is if you do the session write-up. Whoever wants to do it, just work it out amongst yourselves, amongst the players, and somebody do it before the next session. And that was a good way to be like, especially I think one of the things that I liked about that idea was that if you were like, really close to leveling up, you might be like, oh, I really want to do it. And otherwise, I mean, it's an OSR game. So 10% XP, pretty soon it's like, okay, well, I'm going to level. If I do it every time, I'm going to level up in 35 sessions instead of 40 sessions. So who cares very much, right?
And the other way I've seen that done is to offer anybody that writes a write-up would get the bonus. So maybe you'll get 3 write-ups, but that's okay. There's really no harm in it. Or let the players rotate who does it. That way it's even around. I've seen it done both ways. So I think there's ways to do that without it being unfair to players.
Yeah. I know you're talking about cracking jokes. I was in a game where the game master was trying to implemented that. It was more about good role playing, whatever that means. So you had one player who's playing kind of a swashbuckling type of character where the whole character archetype is to engage in banter with the opponents and swing from chandeliers. Very low bar for that kind of a character to do interesting role playing, quote unquote, and get their whatever it is, whatever the reinforcer is. Versus somebody over here who's playing like a scholar who's more about solving puzzles and knowledge and if that doesn't come up, they're just kind of in the background. So you need both those type of characters sometimes in a party, but some of them just more naturally kind of lean into that flair versus a character that doesn't. Whereas the kind of more intellectual style character maybe pulling the party's butt out of the fire every time by some strategic decision or by some creative, but because it's not like funny or doesn't get a big reaction, it kind of goes unnoticed versus the guy doing a backflip or something like that. It's very, very dynamic. So I think if you're going to do that as a game master, making sure you're looking for those opportunities to reward people for doing something creative and not. But that's kind of, I think the danger of it is you get into I think I'm not the first person to comment on this. You get into, well, what entertains this DM? What's not, we're trying to figure out what the DM finds interesting or funny or entertaining, not what does the game need us to do. Yeah, Mark.
I was in a game where there's 2 players in 5e and the GM, and I was playing a monk, and we were doing a short rest at the shore of the ocean. So to get my key back, I don't know who knows 5e here, but during a short rest, you do a meditation as a monk. So I said, I time my breathing with the waves of the ocean. And my GM really liked that, so he gave me a point of inspiration. The other player was like, I just gave you an impassioned speech about the fact that my father was killed by these pirates, which is part of my background, and you didn't give me any advantage for that, any inspiration.
Which rules as written is what you should get inspiration for.
I was about to say that. So yeah, this whole thing of rewards is, what does the GM like? And I wasn't going for inspiration. I enjoyed that, but there's the exact issue that comes up right there. And then I just had a question about write-ups. If you're rewarding players for write-ups, what is the quality that you get for those write-ups? Is it just, I'm checking this box, just giving this write-up, or is it an actual good write-up? And would it be better if they just volunteered to do it anyway? I don't know.
Well, it would be better if they volunteered to do it anyway, but I think both in Arlen's case and my case, we are talking about online games. I guess we should specify that these aren't in-person games. These are online games, and the idea of posting it, because often in an online game, you're going to have one player that's not going to make it, right? or it might go 2 weeks or 3 weeks between games because of scheduling. So having that write-up obviously is important for continuity and all that. And so that, but in an in-person game, Arlen, I can't speak for Arlen, I'm going to throw it to him. But in my case, it was online games and to catch up players that weren't there and things like that. But there was no bar as far, there was a little bit of bar, but I wasn't getting out my red pen and, marking off and all that.
Yeah, I felt like it was, as much as anything, I felt like everybody was sort of on the same page about kind of what needed to be in the write-up and about how long it would actually kind of take. I wasn't expecting too much, just enough to sort of cover all of the major events that happened and that sort of stuff. And yes, for an online game with relatively inconsistent scheduling and a little more inconsistent kind of player attendance and things like that, it felt like it more helpful to have that as kind of a more definitive way to make sure that it would get done, rather than just relying on somebody taking it upon themselves to do it. And that probably would be better if they were inspired. But also, I mean, it's a little bit like writing in other circumstances. If you always wait till you're inspired to write, then you don't end up writing very much. And, I felt like it worked out all right. I will say also, I thought the stories that you guys were talking about, what the GM likes versus what not. I was in a game where it was very much designed as kind of a West Marches dungeon crawly adventure thing, but my character was this kind of ridiculous, over the top, roguish type who did all these sort of Jack Sparrow-esque nonsense and sort of stuff. And one of the things that the GM had done was that at the end of the session, because we were using Zoom for audio, everybody would whisper to the GM which player that they thought was deserving of an extra bonus for XP or reward or whatever else. And I seemed to always win, and felt it was so kind of terribly imposter syndrome, because I'm like, I think I'm just winning because my character is a fun concept that talks a lot, and not really because of anything that I'm doing. It's just everybody else picked a serious character, and I'm the only person who went out of their way to have a character who has kind of a funny personality and isn't nearly as useful in the actual gameplay, but it's kind of fun to listen to. And it was nice to get the reward, but in that case I felt like it's kind of a it's really just a matter of what all the group wants to do. And I always voted for other people because I was under the understanding that you couldn't vote for yourself, so
but at least it's everyone participating in deciding that.
Yes, and I think
GM
that's definitely
fiat.
Yes, and I think that's definitely what I would say is the best way to reward role playing. Kind of like the idea of, if you're going to give somebody a Benny for a good joke, at least have it be a joke that everybody laughs at and not just the GM laughs at, that sort of thing. But there also, I think there totally are moments that, somebody says something that's great and everybody around the table really liked it. And, that I don't necessarily think it's, inconsistent for the GM to be the one to kind of recognize that. But I also think that there are plenty of GMs that I would I think if the GM is the only one who laughs, the only one who likes it, or it's not clear that this is a kind of positive for the group thing, then it becomes a lot less comfortable for that to be rewarded.
Yeah, and you could give, especially to convention game. I know I'm cutting Karl off because I'm rude, but especially convention game, you could have like a different color Benny and give those to all the players that they can reward to other players for good role play or good whatever. And maybe I stole Karl's point, but you could let the players reward each other that way too, which would be a decent way to do it. Everybody has one Benny each session they can give out to somebody else for good role play or something. Sorry, Karl.
No problem. That wasn't my idea, but that's a great idea that I may steal for a convention game or something. But I think like with the joke thing, the problem is then every other player tries to make some sort of like reference to, Aliens or Terminator or, super, Star Wars, Star Trek, whatever.
You laughed on Friday night when I made the Predator reference.
I know, and I don't think you got anything, so sorry. But yeah, exactly. Then everyone starts parroting that, and then if you give a reward the first time, then everyone expects the reward. That's what I try to avoid and try to be objective about things like that. And I think to Mirke's point about, what is the bar for a write-up, I think what I've tried to do is at least throw it out to the group that whoever writes it, it's going to be a group reward. So that if it's bad, well, then it's still a group reward, and we'll see. Although I know one person who wants to make the write-up is going to make themselves the hero of the story, and then maybe that'll incentivize the other players to contribute, because then they're going to be like, but that character didn't do all that, but, well, you let him do the write-up. So, we'll see. It should be pretty fun and funny to see how that goes. And I think the other thing I try to do is be objective about the reward, such that, okay, my players in my regular games know that we get a hero point on the hour, right? And I know some players have actually gamed it, so like they delay until it's like after the clock, so they can get that extra hero point or whatever. But that's also fun. So but I think make it objective so that everyone gets it. It's not a specific reward for a particular player. So then maybe they don't, it's not like that carrot, and then it incentivizes them to continue sort of what might be in the long run distracting behavior at the table, I think.
Yeah, I get it. You were kind of getting into it, but I have done this before with 5e with inspiration, because it's sometimes an unwieldy mechanic when you try to do it as designed. Is I got a handful of special D20s that they're kind of unique color, and I just put a candy dish in the middle of the table, and when anybody does anything worth inspiration, you put a D20 in, and that's now a group pool that at any point you can pull out that, anybody can pull out so, because you're allowed to give the inspiration to other players, but people forget to do it. Well, if you just make it a group resource, that's one way to do it. I think some of the Modifius games with the momentum, it's sort of a group resource. I know Fantasy Flight Star Wars and the Genesis system, that's how it uses its meta currency, is it's a group resource, not an individual player resource. But I think I don't know about any of you guys, but I know I've encountered at least a couple of people in my years as a gamer who would be apoplectic at the thought that something they did earn a reward for everybody and not them. If it was something that token, that discrete as a hero point or a point of inspiration or a Benny, that belongs to my character because I did that. But I tend to not want to play with those kind of people, but they're out there.
Yeah, and that's a great idea. And maybe that also, if you make it a group reward, then maybe if the group is group minded and they want to see success of the group as a whole, say, for example, in a Modifius game, we already have this sort of built-in group pool. Maybe that can happen. And you said that funny joke and everyone laughed. We throw a momentum into the pool, and everyone's like, yes, let's do that. And then hopefully they don't parrot it, but puns get old very quickly. So but so I know some games, though, some modern games do like what Arlen suggested or had said, is that everyone votes for the player that was the star of the show. and I
Mhm.
don't know if I like that so much. I know that for example, in Walking Dead, that's an option, and I know in Walking Dead also you could write an epitaph for something, someone, or something, because it's you got walkers who died in the last episode. And then what I did is I rotated. Actually, I could have anyone do it, but then made the reward a group reward as opposed to like one person. So then one person who loves to do that kind of stuff doesn't keep doing it. And that, I guess that's what I try to do, is make it so that it's fair and objective. And I don't know if I'm always great at that, but at least I try.
I will put forward as a sort of variation on the various ideas of group rewards and group resources that Jason's absolute favorite RPG, Cypher. One of the things that happens is that when a player gets experience in game, and often it's at the cost of a GM intrusion. But the way it works is basically you get two, and you have to give one of them to another person, and you can't just roll a die to decide. You have to choose another player at the table to give the bonus to, and the idea being that that's the sort of camaraderie element. But I think in play that works really well. Especially when you add the element of you can't just roll a die to choose who you give it to. You have to actually pick somebody and say a
Yeah.
reason. That's a good way to be like, no, get into the spirit of helping the players out deliberately. And I think that works
Cypher
well.
Cypher isn't my favorite system, but I did enjoy that mechanic, and I thought that worked really well when I played Cypher.
I have to laugh, yeah.
I want to
BJ, real
take us
quick.
back around to sure.
Maybe you could answer this on like one of your own podcasts, or maybe it's one of your points that you're going to bring up. I don't know. But what is like the psychology behind somebody not getting the reward like you were talking about, but also when, like in my situation where I got the inspiration, but the guy who poured out his heart didn't, what is the demotivation that comes with not getting the reward when they feel like they should? That
Well,
might be something for
exactly.
you to.
They're when everybody's just kind of doing their thing and having a good time, it probably doesn't matter because everything is sort of intrinsically rewarding. But when you start creating that external reward, that's what people are saying is, what do I got to do? That they say people don't quit bad jobs; they quit bad bosses. That's this. I think it's that same principle. Players will get frustrated, going, "Look, I'm doing what you kind of intimated to me I needed to do to sort of keep pace, to earn my bonus XP or my bennies or my inspiration, and you're just not. Why are you? What do I got to do? To earn that? Because you seem to be giving it out left and right to other people for kind of trivial things. So it can be very demotivating for a player, and I think it's kind of cool that player sort of spoke up, and hopefully it was received well by the GM. But I know some people are just going to shut down and eventually just withdraw from the game, particularly if it's an online game where it's really easy to open up another window on your computer or whip out your phone and start checking Facebook. Or when there gets to a natural, they may withdraw from the game, or this campaign ends and we're going to start a new one. And they're like, I think I'm going to take a break. That a lot of people won't say this is what the problem is. They'll say, this isn't for me, guys. I'm too busy right now. I'll check in with you later when life is better. And the next thing they're on is they're on a discussion board looking for a new game to get into. So I think it's an excellent point. Is there's the demoting factor of seeing other people get reinforced when you don't, particularly when you seem to be doing your best to kind of play the game in good faith. So I think that's an excellent point.
So then another question for you, BJ. Then what would be then? Are you allowed to give advice? What would be your suggestion then for how to make a fair gaming experience at the table based on these sort of incentives and de-incentivizing situations?
Yeah. Well, one thing is to make it as objective as possible. This is what we give special rewards for. But I think you have to combine that with knowing your players, what motivates them as players, so that they maybe have a range of things they can choose from for what's comfortable or what fits for them. But then also recognizing in most role-playing games, everybody's not playing the same kind of character. People pick specific skills, specific classes, specific archetypes to explore, and make sure that you're passing the benefits or the rewards around for people doing, to kind of go back to Gary Gygax's thing, if this person chose to play a wizard, make sure you're reinforcing them for playing a wizard. They picked that because they were interested in doing that. This person's playing a rogue. Make sure you give them a chance to really show their skills, and that gets reinforced. If you want to have something that everybody can do in general, though, I think you have to make it very objective of things like, and again, I don't know. That's why I struggle with that. This one in particular is that I'm hard pressed to think of something that everybody does, all players do, other than just playing their characters. So go ahead, Arlen.
I will put forward as an alternative, you could ring a bell every time you give out XP, and your players will start salivating when it's time to give out the rewards.
That's what Karl does. That's where the hero point. We get a hero point on the hour when we play Pathfinder, and
Yeah.
see us all getting antsy, looking at the clock, going, "Oh no, don't don't start the fight yet. Give it, drag it out for 5 more minutes. We'll all get a hero point, right?" The thing I wanted to circle back to, before we wrap up, is the types of motivation or rewards, because to me, and maybe I can go into it a little bit, or I'll let you guys talk about it and I'll tell you what I think, but I think there's a difference in bonus XP, which puts you closer to leveling up your character across the board, versus, I guess, meta currency or bennies that get spent in the game and then they're gone, and they may give you an edge in being successful, but they don't, push you towards leveling up before you normally would, particularly in a game where you've got level, it's the same XP regardless of class, or everybody kind of levels up at the same rate. You're letting someone get there faster than somebody else. As opposed to, like I said, inspiration or bennies or something like that, which gets used in the game and then it's gone, and typically used as a group resource and everybody has access to it. What do you guys think? What do you guys think about that as far as XP versus meta currency as a reward? Again, it may work in certain cases, so I don't want to say yay or nay one way or the other.
Yeah, I guess that's a short term versus long term, right? And just a limited resource or instant gratification versus like the planning. Actually, that probably one or the other would appeal to certain types of characters. Like some characters could care less about give me an extra Benny or not, but they're more interested in their progression. So they're like, oh, I wrote this long 2-page backstory. So do I get extra XP for that? Right. So, I feel like probably the short term is less damaging. The instant gratification is less damaging. It's really the XP bonus, the bonus on the 10% bonus on the XP that I think really as a GM that you have to really consider, and how fair. I think that's what it is. I'm looking at as fairness, right? Fairness to all parties involved, right? So that's what I would be more careful about, the long term versus the instant gratification.
Yeah,
Well,
Jason.
I guess I don't know. The other thing you could look at with the XP though is it gives them a way to offset if they are playing a character. If you're playing somebody with an 18 strength, you're automatic. In a traditional D&D game, you're automatically getting more XP than I am, right? If I'm playing somebody with just regular stats, so it kind of gives them a way to help offset that too. But yeah, I don't know. I think there probably is something there versus XP versus bennies, but I've never heard anybody, especially in the case of like for keeping the game notes and things like that, I've never heard anybody really complain about it, honestly.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Jason that I think I would not do bonus XP in a game like, third edition D&D onwards, basically, where it seems like the expectation of level parity is not necessarily guaranteed, but it's pretty, it seems like that's the way that people play at the very least. And so the idea of, somebody's fifth edition character leveling up a session or two ahead of the rest of the party seems like that's kind of weird. And I don't really want that. In an OSR game, when you're talking about, thousands of XP and you gained 300 for the session, and so an extra 10% is, another 30 XP, it's like, it feels like that's a really easy way, as much as anything, to sort of signal that that is something that is valued without necessarily doing very much to the math to make it difficult to, like I joked about the idea of 35 sessions versus 40 sessions to level up. And that doesn't seem like that bothers, certainly as a player, that wouldn't bother me with the idea of if one person was playing a ridiculous multi-class character and needed an absurd amount of XP, so they always wanted to write the after session write-up. That would be whatever. You got to do that because you're putting too much XP into too many different places. But I do think there's something to, especially with the idea of a lot of meta currency that is often, depending on the game, especially meta currency that is really for lack of a better term, kind of group support oriented, right? I think that that's one of the things that meta currency is often used for, is figuring out oh, well, this is a way that I can help out the whole team by getting a clue to the puzzle, or getting an automatic crit on the big bad so that they don't do as much damage, all of that sort of stuff. That seems like the place where, especially if there's nothing else that the player can use it on, but something that will help the party, it's a lot easier to say that becomes, I think, a sort of fair trade-off. You could make the case that, well, the player who gets the meta currency is the one who gets to have the fun of saying, well, I'm the one who strikes down the big bad villain this session instead of you. But I don't, it seems to me that that's probably the best way to use that type of reward, is to do something that will benefit the group as a whole, even if maybe it, is the most kind of specifically calling out a specific player, that it's something that, the group as a whole is going to enjoy and benefit from.
All right. The last that I had, just as we were talking, is rewarding failure. And I think the first place I saw this was the DM Scotty's luck dice, where anytime a player tries something and fails, they get a D6, and they can just save that to at any point roll to add to increase their damage, to increase their success on a saving throw or an attack roll. And that's wintered its way. I haven't checked the latest playtest, but this new version of D&D that's coming out, the suggestion was that to gain inspiration whenever somebody fails. I can't remember if it may just be when they roll a 1. But it sort of naturally occurs. It doesn't occur that often unless it's just failure of any type. But it keeps that meta currency flowing, and it's going to happen often enough that people will spend it instead of hoarding it. But what do you guys think about that? Just sort of giving somebody a Benny or a meta currency when they fail spectacularly.
I like that, but that goes back to the roots of the hobby as well. As early as 1975, we see Tunnels and Trolls where you get XP for failing saving throws. So this is a mechanic that's been your roll master. When you get hit, you get XP by being in those fights, because you get XP when you get your butt kicked, right? So this is something that's been around in the games, but I like it. I like the idea. DM Scotty's dice, his setup is really neat. I like the way he does that. And even if it's as simple as when you roll critical failure, you get a Benny or you get whatever, I think that's a cool way to go, because you're already suffering the penalty for failing anyway. So giving them that little bit isn't going to unbalance the game, because like you say, it's determined by the dice. And you don't need to give a bonus if they get a critical success, because that's its own reward.
Right.
The only type of failure-based advancement that I like is Burning Wheel. where you have to fail like 8 times and succeed 10 times to upgrade your skill level. No, in all seriousness, I think it's fun. I think it sort of depends on like the type of game that you're playing, and obviously some rules don't work as well for that. Like depending on how powerful the meta currency is. I think the idea of adding a d6 to a d20 roll is not a huge bonus. And especially if you don't already have a large bonus on something, you kind of can't get enough on just the d6 to like turn a nat 1 into a success with your +1 d6, which is kind of a nice way that it sort of balances out naturally on some level, as opposed to, right, like if you got an extra d6 in Savage Worlds, that thing might explode 3 times, and that would, totally change the shape of whatever is happening.
Yep.
But I think it's a nice, like the idea of getting a little bit of something from failure is always kind of a nice way to, especially I think it works really well for games where part of the expectation is that characters will sort of go outside of their kind of comfort zone, what they're good at, right? Have the fighter try to read the magical text because it would be kind of interesting for the story, whether or not that's what you would naturally do. And that if you have a little bit of incentive to failure, then that kind of helps soothe over the nat 1 that you roll and the fighter summons a demon, and now it's very, very bad.
Well, it certainly helps players stop being risk averse, which when we were talking about kind of the behaviors we would like to change in players across the board. I think that's a big one for game masters, is when the group becomes too risk adverse and you just can't advance any of the adventure because they're, you've got 6 players and every one of them wants to check a treasure chest for traps. Every one of them wants to listen at the door, and it just becomes a slog. Whereas, well, just open the door and see what's in there. It all comes to a head, and I'm thinking of a session last week where I should have probably given someone a luck die, because I'm using that right now with my group. This fighter, they're kind of waiting in the foyer of this building. They've been invited in, and they were kind of suspicious as to whether they're what they're investigating. And this player who's playing, she's one of the more introverted players of the group, but she's playing a halfling fighter who's, I'll check this door. So she opens the door and she kind of goes in and looks around. I'm like, well, there's suits of armor against the back wall. She's like, oh, really? Well, she took a step towards, they animate, and it's actually skeletons. They're now coming. So she runs out. She slams the door, has enough movement and one initiative to get out of the room. And she goes, can I prop a chair up against the door? And I was like, sure. So she grabs a chair and props it up and, tells everybody there's skeletons in the other room, but, I've propped the door. And I'm like, but remember the door opens inward, right? So the skeletons just up and open the door. I thought I should have given her one of the, it's failure, but it's entertaining failure. You tried something and something interesting happened. And even though didn't work out the way you wanted, that's where you should have gotten one of those meta currencies to have for that. So, all right. Well, we've gone for about an hour and a half. I guess we go, any final thoughts? We just would go around the group. Karl, do you have any kind of summary statement or?
No, I think I kind of, I don't know, words of wisdom, but I think it's really when you think about and look at what kind of rewards, out of game rewards, to give to your players, I think you should do it in the most fair manner. That you hopefully a group reward as opposed to an individual award, and think of not just, in a one shot, maybe it doesn't matter so much, but in a long-term game, what are the ramifications? What's going to happen down the road if the jokester in the group is always joking, getting rewards? He's going to keep joking, right? And then that's eventually not going to be productive for the group, right? So, I think you just got to think
Karl
about.
asked me not to play in his games anymore.
Oh, come on. So the second hero of anyway. So, okay. Yeah, you're always invited. Anyway, that's the way I would tackle it.
Yeah. Now, I could see where you're trying to actually have a serious moment, delicate negotiation with the Duke, and you've rewarded this guy for making smart ass comments for 6 sessions and completely ruins it.
Although that could make for an interesting. If he does that in character, that could make for an interesting situation.
Yeah. Or spoil somebody else's effort to really do have their serious moment of negotiation, and that's how they're role playing, and they kind of, Arlen, you have any final comments or final thoughts?
No, I agree with Karl. I think as with sort of, especially as with almost anything that is sort of an unwritten part of, as much as anything about kind of group dynamic and communication, that there's potential for hurt feelings or discomfort that is just a sort of part of how people interact, and especially in a situation like RPG gaming, where the GM often has a whole lot more power in the relationship than any individual player, that it is just, important to, as much as I was joking about, I know Karl wouldn't ask me not to play in his games unless it was making a lot of the other players upset, and then he might, and I think that's appropriate, because that's really the sort of core point is, what's going to give the group as a whole a positive experience, and that's a thing to always keep in mind and to be flexible. I think that one of the things that we might run into in the hobby is attachment to an idea that doesn't turn out to work very well in play, and being flexible and open with the idea of, well, I thought that giving 10% XP for whoever writes up the session is a good idea, but it turns out it's not really necessary, or somebody doesn't like it, or whatever else. To be, open to figuring out what the group likes, whether or not it's the first idea that comes up or what you kind of started with session 0.
Great. Mirke?
I think my takeaway from the conversation is, whether it's in-game or out-of-game rewards, there could be knock-on effects that you can't really tell. There's a group dynamic, and then there's an individual with each person dynamic that you've got to be carefully thinking through what you're going to reward or not reward. And it's probably going to be an ongoing discussion with your group as you're trying to implement these things. So just be careful what you're doing with your rewards.
Yeah. And I think as a game master, it's important to be upfront. If there's a particular way you run the game, and you're particularly with new players, let them know, this is how I do it. I don't budge on this. So if you play a couple of sessions and decide this isn't for you, no hard feelings if you say this isn't really my cup of tea. Or if you're kind of exploring an idea, say, hey guys, I'm exploring this idea. I'd like some feedback on whether it's working for you or not, and we'll decide as a group whether it's working for us or not. But I think my stance has always been, and we haven't got into sort of problem players. It's probably a whole other discussion of, it's kind of important to incentivize and disincentivize what the character is doing within the context of the game world. If a player is being obnoxious as they're an obnoxious person to have at the table, and they're irritating everybody else, you don't have a dragon drop out of the sky and kill their character. You pull that person aside and say, hey, look, we can't do that here. To keep those separate, which I don't think is what today's discussion has been about, but it is a related topic. But I think just being really open as a GM as to kind of how you do things, what's up for negotiation, what's not, so players can make an informed decision about whether they want to play or not in your game. So anyway, well, Jason, we'll give you the final word here. What's your final perspective?
Yeah, I think it's been, we've lightly covered the topic. Obviously, we could keep talking for a long time on this and go into examples and more detailed cases. But yeah, the big takeaways here are, be careful of those cascading effects, those unforeseen consequences, right? So yeah, I don't really have any words of wisdom to add either. I'm like Karl. I kind of think that BJ made that important point, though, and so to Mirke, the idea of check-ins. And yeah, this isn't just a session 0 discussion. It's a ongoing discussion throughout the campaign or throughout the game life of your group. Even if you're playing one-shots and short adventures, make sure that everybody's on the same sheet of music, and check back in with your players to make sure they're having fun, or make sure everybody's agreeing on these things often, because it is a group activity, and you, the GM, need to have fun, but so do your players, and you don't want to chase people away because your girlfriend gets all the bennies, or your boyfriend does, or whatever. You know what I mean? You can't have favorites in this kind of thing, or just the person, like, Arnold's kind of mentioned, the person that makes you laugh the most. It's got to be a general. It's got to be the best for the group, not for you as the GM. So,
all right. Very good. Very good. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys joining in the discussion today. I think when we get this out, we'll certainly put links to everybody's podcasts and YouTube channels and blogs in the show description. So again, if you listen to this episode, probably a lot of stuff to digest. So take it for what it's worth, and hopefully we will be back with some more Cerebrivore in the near future. I think we'd like to revitalize this a little bit, but right now I think we're also having to think about what to do with the collapse of Spotify for podcasters, and how we record and produce episodes is something that we're still trying to, I think most of us are trying to sort through. So yeah, Jason, did you have one other thing?
Yeah, just to say that, this is on the old feed. That'll stay up as long as Spotify lets us keep it up there. It's also will be on YouTube. The old episodes and the new ones will be on YouTube. And all the ways to contact us if you want to give feedback is in the show notes as well. There is a SpeakPipe account, and there's an email, and there's all of it's in the show notes. So check that out. But there are a lot of ways you can give feedback. And if you do give feedback, then we'll comment, or whoever's here, I might not be here, but whoever's on the panel in the future will comment back on your feedback. So
and you'll get a Benny for it.
Yeah, and you'll get a Benny for giving feedback. Yeah. So
we'll give
or somebody shows up with a stick.
All right. Well, again, thank you guys for joining us. It's been a great conversation. So we'll hopefully get together at some point in the future and then have some more stuff to talk about.
Excellent. Thank you.
Everybody take care out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A Nerds and Co broadcast, Cerebrivore podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the spinal tap straw. The all-stars of pods past, Cerebrivore podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Zombies, blood and teeth will soon be scraping your brain and clean. What I mean is this machine is a freak, and from what I understand, it hasn't eaten for weeks. Don't look now, the Cerebrivore is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bleed and you can hide all the above in any order. Just another rainbow regal tossed us running for the border. Just a snap, tried to warn you, did I stutter? Beer and pain, all various breads and butters, all you can eat unabated, and its dust is never sated. Is it savoring the flavor of the memories it created?